Hospitals are places filled with stories, many of which never get told. Some can be heartwarming, others hard to hear, and sometimes there are those that challenge what we consider normal. Today, I want you to get comfortable, take a deep breath, and listen to an account that even now leaves the one who lived through it without answers. Good evening, Dom. I decided to write because this experience stays with me to this day. I'm not sure if I'm looking for answers or simply want to get it off my chest, but I hope you can understand. I prefer to remain anonymous. My name, place of residence, and any details that could identify me will not be revealed. Even the names mentioned here have been changed because, frankly, they don't matter much. What's essential is my experience, and I trust you'll understand why by the end. I work as a nurse at a renowned hospital in my city. When this incident occurred, I was still employed there, but I've since taken an opportunity at another hospital, a bit farther away. I spent years working at the same place and had never noticed anything like what began happening unexpectedly. Interestingly, there were no changes in management or staff, and the hospital had always been strict in selecting new employees. Even so, something strange started to occur. Mr. Fabio, how are you today? Are you alone in the room again? What happened to the young man sharing the space with you? Was he discharged? Yesterday he seemed to be recovering well, I asked, referring to the elderly gentleman who was hospitalized in the same ward when the events began. Mr. Fabio, a fictitious name I should note, was sharing the room with a young man of about 25. The young man had been admitted after surgery due to injuries from an accident, and as I mentioned to Mr. Fabio, his condition seemed to be improving. However, his response was surprising. No, he wasn't discharged. It was worse. It seems he passed away during the night. A doctor came in to give me medication, and I felt very drowsy afterward. Since I'm a light sleeper, I woke up a short time later and saw what was happening. The young man was completely covered by a sheet, like a corpse. There was a nurse and 2 other people beside him, preparing the body to be removed. I felt very sad. I spoke with him near midnight as if everything was normal and I didn't notice any signs that something was wrong. That's why I believe he might have suffered cardiac arrest or something similar. I asked my colleagues, other nurses, about what had happened, but no one gave me an answer. I only saw when they took the young man's body away on a gurney. Before they left, they asked me to pray for him. Their expressions showed sadness, similar to what you seem to feel now. I was in disbelief. At that moment, all I could think about was how fragile life is. I'm sorry to insist, but I'll repeat, he was fine. I personally examined him shortly before my shift ended. I administered Mr. Fabio's medications, checked his IV, and tried to comfort him, promising that he would soon be fully recovered. The young man had been admitted due to an intestinal issue. While his recovery was slow, the prognosis was positive, and everything pointed to him going home. After leaving the room, I went to the nursing station, where I usually found my colleagues. One of the nurses was there, and trying to appear casual, I asked if she knew anything about the death of the patient in room 84. To my surprise, she didn't know either, and the strangest part, she had been on duty hours before I arrived. I decided to ask 2 other colleagues I had a good relationship with, but I got the same answer. No one knew anything. As the hours passed, despite the sadness I felt, because yes, we nurses also grieve when we lose a patient. We interact with them daily, meet their families, and hope for their recovery. It's not uncommon for us to form bonds of friendship. I tried to focus on caring for the other patients. After all, with so many professionals on alternating shifts, I thought I would eventually find someone who could shed light on what had happened. But that didn't happen. 2 days later, at the start of another shift, I ran into a colleague, whom I'll call Cesar, who seemed visibly worried. When I asked why, he revealed, "You also work on the 2nd floor, so you must remember the young man who had been here since last week. He was admitted due to an infection and was nearly recovered. I personally monitored his recovery. But this morning, when I came in for my shift, they told me he passed away during the night. I can't believe it. The nurses said a special team removed the body, but no one knows what happened or the cause of death." Cesar's words only made everything even more mysterious. Completely shaken by all this, I decided to go to the pathology room, or morgue, where the bodies are kept, to check if I wasn't mistaken. I used the excuse of delivering some documents. I just came back from there, and now I'm here to tell you the body wasn't there. The on-duty pathologist, Dr. Louise, assured me that perhaps the family had already taken it because, when he arrived, the body was no longer in the room. I found this very strange. The infection the young man had wasn't contagious or fatal. He had already recovered. I thought maybe the family had requested the body for cremation, but even in that case, an autopsy would have been mandatory and the timeline would have been too tight. You know how these things work. None of this makes sense here or in any other hospital. I stood there in silence, stunned. I couldn't help but remember what had happened with the patient in room 84. At that time, I didn't delve deeper. I didn't go to the morgue to investigate. But now, my colleague Cesar and I were intrigued all day long. A few days later, still haunted by doubt, another incident occurred. This time, the victim was a woman. A nurse who worked in the same ward was the one who told us what happened. It's worth mentioning that neither Cesar nor I had spoken about the previous cases to anyone. I'm sure of this because we agreed to keep quiet and alert each other if anything was revealed. The nurse told us, "Last night, as I was leaving the hospital to head to the parking lot, I realized I'd forgotten some documents in the nursing station. I immediately went back to get them. On my way, I ran into a colleague and chatted with him for about 10 minutes. After we said goodbye, I continued to retrieve the papers. When I reached my floor, the corridor was completely empty. That's when something caught my attention. As I passed by an office with the door slightly ajar, I glanced inside. There I saw several people I'd never seen before. I'm sure they weren't staff. We know everyone who works here, and those people weren't. I thought about going in to see who they were, but at that moment I heard a voice I instantly recognized. It was Dr. Almeida. He was saying to whoever was there, "It's better to stop now, or they'll start to suspect." I don't know who he was referring to or what he was talking about, but I heard it clearly. I froze with fear. I decided to retrieve my documents. After I got them, I waited for a while, trying to calm myself down. A few minutes later, I left the room, but I ran into the same people again. Only this time they were wearing hospital uniforms. I didn't know what to do. I stood still, unable to muster the courage to leave. When I finally gathered enough courage and exited the room, the corridor was empty again. This account left us even more unsettled, as if a greater mystery was hidden within our workplace. I left the hospital hurriedly, praying I wouldn't encounter anyone along the way. As I passed by the entrance to the office where I had seen the group earlier, I noticed the room was now completely deserted. The biggest shock came when I cast a quick glance at the patient's room the group had entered. The patient was gone. She simply wasn't there anymore. I swear on everything I hold dear, I had seen this woman when I passed by earlier and again at the end of my shift. I clearly remember who she was. A young woman named Tavares, about to be discharged after recovering from a mild case of pneumonia. I don't know why I'm sharing this with you or if you'll believe me, but I'm terrified. Something strange is happening at the hospital, and I don't want to be complicit in any of it. By the way, I mentioned the name of the doctor I saw with them. Please keep that confidential. The nurse begged us to keep her confession between us. She also said it might all be a product of her imagination, but it was clear she only said this out of fear, and no one could blame her. This was the last peculiar episode involving a patient. The rest of the week went by without any news. With the shift changes, we learned even less about what happened during the night. A few days after that conversation, we were informed that the nurse had left the hospital. The news caught us off guard, so Cesar and I decided to visit her at her apartment to check if she was all right. She lived 2 blocks from the hospital in a high-end condominium, consistent with the quality of the hospital and the surrounding area. Just to situate you without revealing too much, let's say this happened in one of the wealthiest areas in Mexico. When she greeted us, the panic on her face was evident. She didn't invite us in, spoke to us right there at the door, with brief and hesitant words. As we left, she handed us a piece of paper with an address and a time. She said it was the reason she had decided to change jobs. We were torn about whether or not to go to the place she indicated. According to her, the information came from a reliable source, another person who had also decided to leave the hospital. But the warning was clear: if we got involved, we'd face the same risks. This uncertainty haunted us. Even so, Cesar and I concluded that we couldn't rest without investigating, despite having nothing more than an address and a time written down. The location described led us to a village on the outskirts of the city, along a road connecting several localities. Specifically, it was an old first aid station, once the only healthcare facility in the area, but long abandoned. Cesar didn't know this, but I was aware that the place no longer operated, completely deserted and forgotten. We went there as soon as our shift ended. The drive wasn't too long, around 30 to 40 minutes along the mentioned road. And don't think we went without taking precautions. I sent messages to my parents letting them know I'd be in that area, just so they'd know where to look if something happened. It might seem insane to go there out of curiosity, but the scenario was too strange. Patients disappeared without anyone seeing them with family members, and employees were leaving a hospital with excellent salaries and a prime location. Why wasn't anyone clearly stating whether it was safe to keep working there? When we arrived at the stretch of road where the place was located, we found only emptiness. Although the municipality had houses, that specific area was overrun with vegetation. Unfortunately, there's not much to report about what we witnessed, as it seems we arrived too late. 3 police vehicles were parked in front of the building with their sirens on, attracting the attention of some locals observing from a distance. Still, we managed to hear something one of them shared. He wasn't the one who discovered the scene, but said something terrible had happened. Apparently, a passerby noticed flames coming from one of the rooms and, thinking it was a fire, called the police. The police arrived along with the firefighters, but as it turns out, the fire wasn't accidental. When they realized there was no actual fire, the firefighters left, leaving the police to handle the scene. According to the residents' account, the flames had been intentionally started to burn a body. This isn't something we made up. We saw the police activity. According to what he described, the body was placed on some sort of altar in a setup reminiscent of satanic rituals seen in movies or chilling reports. Additionally, other residents claimed to have seen around 10 people dressed in black fleeing toward the nearby hills. The police gathered information and listened to these stories while investigating the building's interior. Inside, they found only the body used in that night's ritual. Later, we learned that behind the building, they discovered other burned bodies in the same manner, as if it were part of a macabre event. At the time, the newspapers reported only the discovery of one body, that of a woman. To this day, we suspect it was the missing patient, but we're not certain, as we didn't see enough. What we felt that night was pure terror. We tried returning to the nurse's apartment who had given us the address, but she no longer lived there. According to the landlord, she had vanished in the middle of the night, leaving everything behind and waiting for family members to collect her belongings. As for those responsible for the ritual, or what we believe was a cult, they were never found. At least, that's what the news said. Shortly after, TV reports dismissed the entire story. They claimed there had been no ritual, no people in black, and that it was all a misunderstanding. This way, they discredited what witnesses and newspapers had reported. But that's not all. I remember the newspaper mentioning that the person who made the anonymous report, calling to report the incident, was treated as a hero, as strange as that sounds. However, on a TV news program, there was a complete contradiction. The whistleblower was no longer anonymous, and they revealed it was a doctor named Almeida. Remember the name I mentioned earlier? Well, after that episode, Dr. Almeida was never seen at the hospital again. The official explanation was that he had been transferred to another facility, but no additional information emerged. You might judge us as cowards and wonder why we didn't take what we knew to the police or try to contact the families of the missing patients, who we believe were the ones disappearing from the hospital. But what could we do in the face of a police force that claimed it was merely a fire? Especially in a state notorious for corruption and given the influence wielded by the wealthy elite of the region. Who would guarantee our safety and ensure we wouldn't also vanish, just like our former colleague? She knew too much, and because of that, she was either forced to flee or made to disappear. We have no doubt that something happened. To us, Dr. Almeida was no hero. He was or still is part of this cult. Something happened that made him call the police himself and force the rest of the group to flee. Or perhaps it was all part of a larger plan. In the end, patient disappearances in hospitals around the world continue to happen to this day. Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to get the latest stories. Your presence means a lot, and your support is essential. All right, let's keep going. My family owns a simple vacation cabin in the state of Colorado. My parents have always been passionate about skiing, and it was this passion that led them to buy the property. The house has been in the family longer than I can remember, as it was purchased even before I was born. It shows visible signs of wear and tear, natural for a property that's over 4 decades old. Over the years, my dad has put in a lot of effort to keep it in good condition, but despite all the care, it's becoming clear that its time is running out. Every now and then, my dad mentions tearing it down and building something new in its place. I prefer not to get involved in such decisions. The story I'm about to share happened about 15 years ago when I was just 8 years old and my brother was 11. During one of those heavy Colorado snowstorms, we spent a few days at the cabin. The amount of snow was unbelievable, and of course my brother and I took the opportunity to play outside. What we loved most about that house was the enormous property it sat on. It had a large open area surrounded by trees and a road that ended in a cul-de-sac, leading to other equally spacious properties. It was the perfect setting for games like hide and seek, snowball fights, and other games we made up. That day, Jonas and I went out in our snow gear to play one of our favorite games, a snowball fight with custom rules. Each of us had to build a fort somewhere on the property and choose a treasure snowball to protect. The goal was to invade the other's fort, steal the treasure snowball, and bring it back to our own fort. Jonas decided to build his fort on a neighboring property, close to ours. That house was almost always vacant, so we played there without anyone bothering us. As soon as Jonas ran off toward the road to set up his fort, he promised to blow his whistle to signal the start of the game. I waited patiently, but the whistle never came. After about 5 minutes, I started getting restless. When I realized 10 minutes had passed with no sign from Jonas, I thought maybe I just couldn't hear it. So I decided to plan my own route to his fort. I considered cutting through the forest, but the idea of going through the snowy woods alone at 8 years old was terrifying. I opted to take the road instead. The road hadn't been cleared of snow, and the flakes fell directly onto my face as I walked, but the layers of clothing my mom had made me wear kept me warm. When I reached the entrance to the neighboring property, I looked through the trees and saw no sign of Jonas. In winter, with the trees stripped of leaves, it was easier to see through the woods, but he simply wasn't there. I carefully entered the property, thinking I might catch him by surprise, but I couldn't find him. I got to the fort he had built and looked around. Confirming he wasn't nearby, I prepared to grab the treasure. Before I could reach for the snowball, I heard a woman's voice yelling, "Hey, are you looking for your brother?" I turned toward the sound and saw an older woman standing at the door of the neighboring house. I shouted back that we were just playing. She replied, "Your brother isn't here," and I was completely thrown off by the situation. I started approaching the front steps of the house, and as I got closer, the woman's face became clearer. To my 8-year-old eyes, she seemed much older than she probably was. As I drew closer, something strange caught my attention. In one of the upstairs windows, someone was watching me. For a moment, I thought it was Jonas. It was a figure with part of their face hidden, maybe by a black cap, and the rest obscured by the window. I also noticed another set of footprints leading to the front door and assumed they might be his. The woman's expression was a strange smile, almost unsettling. My heart started racing, though I didn't understand why. Then she invited me inside to get out of the cold. Instinctively, I stopped in my tracks and shouted, "Jonas!" There was no response. At that moment, the woman's smile vanished, as if she hadn't expected me to do that. Looking back at the footprints, I noticed there were tracks coming and going, as if Jonas had returned toward the forest. Then I heard heavy footsteps inside the house coming down from the upper floor. Without a second thought, I started running. The woman shouted something, but I couldn't make it out. I glanced back briefly as I fled and saw that the face in the window was no longer there. I ran along the road, following my own footprints in the snow. It wasn't long before I heard my dad's characteristic whistle calling us for dinner. He always did that when it was time to come home. When I reached the garage, my dad and Jonas were there, walking toward me. Before I could explain what had happened, Jonas began talking. He said there were people in the neighboring house and they had tried to invite him inside. I told them what I had experienced, which prompted my dad to grab a gun and head over there while we stayed with my mom. When he came back, he said the front door was locked and no one answered. He then went to another neighbor who knew the owners of the house, and together they called them. This is the part that still gives me chills. The owners confirmed they weren't there that weekend. In other words, no one was supposed to be in the house. They called the police, and my brother and I had to describe the woman to one of the officers. After that, we weren't involved in the investigation anymore. My dad mentioned that the back door was unlocked and that the police had searched the house but found nothing. After that incident, my parents decided to take all the valuable items from the property back home, worried about potential break-ins in the future. As for Jonas and me, we never played on that property again. The fear from that memory was enough to keep us away. Today I feel relieved that we stayed outside and didn't go into that house. I'm going to share something curious that happened to me. I'm a construction worker with decades of experience, and for the past 20 years, I've been working in different locations with a contractor. Sometimes we travel to other states. I can't recall exactly which part of Oaxaca it was, since it's been a long time, but we worked on the reconstruction of a huge house near a river. For this project, they hired 5 master builders, and each brought 3 assistants, making a total of 8 people. When we arrived at the site, I was surprised. I had imagined something more urban, but it was a large, rustic countryside house with 2 floors, quite remote. The boss explained the details of what needed to be done. Some of the workers were assigned to the bathrooms, both upstairs and downstairs. Meanwhile, my assistant Andre and I were tasked with the outdoor area, where we had to rebuild a brick wall that had collapsed. We started working on a Tuesday with a 2-week deadline to complete everything. We decided to sleep on site since the workdays would be long, from 7 in the morning until 10 or 11 at night. The first day was exhausting. By 11 o'clock we made dinner. While we were eating, we distinctly heard footsteps upstairs. Everyone froze, food halfway to their mouths, and exchanged glances. The footsteps grew louder until the lamp in the living room started to sway. No one said a word for about 10 seconds, and then the steps stopped. After that, we laughed awkwardly and went to sleep on the floor as best as we could. The next day, we woke up at 6:30 and got back to work. Andre and I chatted while working until around 10 at night. The masters decided to extend the shift until midnight, since we wanted to pour concrete into the beams of the freshly raised walls. When we went to prepare the mortar, we realized we had run out of water. The boss had warned us this might happen. Since the mix was still damp, our only option was to fetch water from the river about a 2-minute walk from the site. The assistants went first, made 1 trip, came back and poured the water into the mix. They repeated the trip again. On the 3rd trip, while we worked, drank soda and chatted, I noticed it was already 11 at night and asked for help from the other masters. Everyone grabbed buckets and we headed to the river. When we arrived, we paused for a moment, admiring how beautiful the water looked. While filling the 2nd bucket, Andre and another colleague pointed something out. "Hey, what's that?" When I looked, I saw in the darkness a figure that looked like a white dress right in the middle of the river. We tried to see it more clearly, but it looked like a mist in a human shape. The figure began floating toward us, moving across the river. We quickly filled our buckets, and just as we turned to leave, we heard a blood-curdling scream. Everyone panicked. One of the assistants bolted, while the rest of us carried the buckets, hearts pounding. A few steps later, another wail cut through the darkness. It sounded so close, like it was right in our ears. I glanced back, hoping to confirm it wasn't following us, but all I saw were my colleagues' terrified faces. The 3rd scream sounded farther away, but the sound still pierced the air as if it were a part of it. We returned with the buckets nearly empty, but we were all pale and trembling. As we mixed the mortar, we talked about what had happened. The fear gradually turned into nervous laughter and jokes to lighten the mood. Tassio, trying to be funny, said he would have told the weeping woman to stop crying and would have made her some new, prettier buckets. Everyone burst out laughing, especially since he was the first one to drop everything and run. Even so, we managed to finish our work around 1 in the morning, rested a bit, and were back at it by 7. The following days were uneventful. I spent my time working on another wall while everyone focused on their tasks. For 3 days, nothing strange happened. However, on Monday night, around 11, while we were having dinner, eggs and ham, we heard footsteps upstairs again, but this time they sounded like high heels. The sound began in one of the farthest rooms and traveled down the entire hallway, stopping at the top of the stairs. We exchanged nervous glances. Trying to break the tension, I joked with Tassio, saying if he went to check it out, he wouldn't have to work the next day. He played along, laughing, but everyone's laughter stopped the moment the feminine footsteps started descending the stairs. 1 step, then another, and another. Suddenly, the pace quickened, as if whatever it was running down. In a split second, Tassio, Andre, Caio, and I jumped up from the table and huddled in a corner like frightened kids. We waited, expecting to see something horrifying appear at the staircase, but all we heard was the sound, terrifying yet invisible. The footsteps stopped on the ground floor, leaving a heavy silence behind. At that moment, we decided we wouldn't spend another night there. We had already received our week's pay, so we opted to walk half an hour to the nearest town and pay for a lodge. We finished the work during the remaining days, always working from morning until late afternoon. After that, we never saw or heard anything unusual again. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to leave a like. It really makes a difference. Okay, let's continue. Since I can remember, skiing has been a part of my life. My parents, who met while competing in the sport, always made sure my siblings and I learned at an early age. Now in my 20s, it feels like skiing is part of who I am. This story took place when I was 21, still finishing my last year of college. For those familiar with the Northeast, you know Vermont boasts some of the best ski destinations. That winter, Adam, Ronald, David, and I planned a typical trip for us. I can't remember exactly which mountain we chose. Adam was in charge of booking and Ronald drove, but it was massive, with 7 lifts connecting different peaks. Maybe it was Killington. We skied for almost 2 full days and it still felt like we hadn't explored everything. On the second day, already familiar with the trails, we decided to push ourselves. Between runs, we took a few swigs of Fireball, our tradition. The double black diamond slopes became the stage for our competitions, racing down as fast as possible. With about an hour left before the lifts closed, we were exhausted but knew we'd miss it as soon as we left. While standing at the top of a lift, deciding how to end our trip, 2 girls without helmets approached us. I have to say, they were so stunning it was impossible not to notice them. One blonde, the other brunette. Emily and Hannah, as they introduced themselves, complained about how boring it was with so many older people on the mountain, something I'd also mentioned to the group earlier. It made sense they'd approach a group of young guys around their age. Hannah seemed experienced in skiing, asking David technical questions about his gear. She seemed impressed that he and Ronald owned their skis, while Adam and I always rented. Emily, on the other hand, commented on our Fireball shots, laughing when we said it unlocked our ultimate skiing abilities. They found it amusing. To our surprise, Hannah pulled out an unlabeled bottle and teased us, calling Fireball amateur stuff. We took the challenge and drank a little. I noticed Ronald getting visibly more cheerful, typical when he overindulged, but it wasn't unexpected. I stayed cautious. Something about the situation felt a bit off, so I decided to take it easy. Meanwhile, David was in full flirt mode as usual, and Emily seemed to enjoy it. I figured the plan would be to spend the rest of the time on the mountain with them. Maybe we'd even find something fun to do after the resort closed. Hannah asked if we knew a trail called Devil's Forest. I'd never heard of it. Our friend Chase, who usually memorized every detail of the maps, wasn't with us this time. We said we didn't know it, and the girls explained it was a rare glade trail, almost never open. For those unfamiliar, these trails go through forests, requiring skiers to navigate around trees. This type of trail was our favorite, so we got excited. We accepted their invitation and followed them to a narrow spot where we had to remove our skis and hike up a section on foot. I realized we were already in a quieter part of the mountain. The snow looked untouched and no one else was around. Despite finding it strange, the idea of an adventure excited us, so we continued, slightly buzzed and curious. David and Ronald led the way, eager for the chance to keep flirting, while Adam and I hung back, giving them space. I noticed Adam seemed uneasy and asked what was bothering him. He and I are usually the most rational in the group. David acts on impulse and Ronald would follow a girl anywhere she wanted to go. Adam mentioned how odd it was to have a trail that required hiking to access, something we'd never encountered before. I agreed and suggested we stay alert. After all, what could two girls do against four big guys like us? Once we entered the forest, the terrain leveled out. We rejoined the group and saw that David and Ronald were already comfortable, with Ronald hugging Hannah, who smiled. The girls pointed to the path ahead, where the terrain started sloping downward. I sighed, thinking Chase would have been helpful to figure out where we were. Still skeptical, Adam asked if they were sure the trail was legitimate. They both assured us it was and claimed it would lead us back to the lifts. Before I could say anything, Hannah pulled out the bottle again and insisted we finish it. David and Ronald took generous gulps. When it was Adam's turn, he refused, saying he'd had enough. For a brief moment, I saw Hannah's face change, almost as if she was annoyed, but she quickly smiled again, as if nothing had happened. None of my friends seemed to notice. With a seductive tone, she kept insisting until Adam reluctantly gave in just to end the conversation. When the bottle reached me, I pressed it to my lips and pretended to drink, not swallowing a drop. Something about the situation didn't add up, and every instinct told me not to trust it. I handed the bottle back, and that's when I realized the entire time I hadn't seen either of them drink. I checked my phone. There was only half an hour left before the lifts closed. I made up an excuse, saying we wouldn't have time to get back to the parking lot if we took that trail. The girls insisted it wouldn't be an issue and that the lifts connected at the bottom. Suddenly, they took off ahead of us, challenging us to keep up. David and Ronald didn't hesitate and chased after them, clearly expecting the trail to lead to something worthwhile. Adam and I followed reluctantly. At that point, it felt like we had no other option. I let Adam go ahead. Despite everything, navigating a tree-filled trail requires focus. When I reached the bottom, I felt relieved to see the group laughing as before. But something was off. There was no lift, just more forest around us. Frustrated, I asked the girls where the lift was. They told us to calm down, saying it was nearby and they'd take us there. I tried to relax, thinking I might be overreacting. As I rubbed my eyes, I heard a thud in the snow. When I looked, I saw Ronald collapsed, unconscious. The girls laughed, calling him a lightweight, but this seemed more serious. Before I could react, David dropped too. Panicking, I rushed to them, removing my skis. Thankfully, they were breathing, but it was terrifying. Adam confronted the girls, asking what was going on. They claimed they didn't know, but when he stepped closer, he also collapsed. I stood there, frozen in disbelief. My head started spinning and I thought I'd be next. The girls no longer pretended. They stared at me, waiting for me to fall. Feeling dizzy, I sat in the snow, trying to stay awake. I demanded to know what they had given us, but they remained silent, unmoving. Despite the heaviness in my body, I kept my eyes open. After a few minutes, Emily turned to Hannah and said, "He didn't drink enough." Hannah cursed and said they needed to leave. They grabbed David and Ronald's skis, leaving theirs behind, and started walking away through the forest. Despite my numbness, I knew I had to act. They wouldn't get far carrying 2 pairs of skis each. Slowly, I regained some movement. Staggering, I followed their tracks. I was surprised at how far they'd gotten, even with all that weight. Eventually, I caught sight of them. They were heading into a curve, so I kept following, staying out of sight. Suddenly, the scenery changed. I exited the forest into a clearing that led to a road. There was a van parked there. I stopped immediately. I saw the side door slide open and 4 large men stepped out to meet the girls. They gestured to the men and one of them looked directly at me, pointing in my direction. My heart raced. I realized I'd made a mistake leaving my friends behind. While they debated whether to come after me, I turned and began stumbling back along the snowy trail. My only thought was to get back to my friends, who were still unconscious. Fortunately, they didn't follow me. If they had, I might not be here to tell this story. When I reached my friends, they were still where I'd left them. I decided to start with Adam, since he had drunk less. After sprinkling some snow on his face, he opened his eyes, dazed. I explained what had happened. Together we tried to wake David and Ronald, but they didn't respond immediately. Adam and I decided our best hope was to pray those people wouldn't return. They didn't. After about an hour, David and Ronald finally woke up, and we recounted everything we could remember. There were so many unanswered questions. Who were those girls? And the men with them? What had they planned to do with us? The weight of what might have happened if I hadn't pretended to drink was suffocating. In the best-case scenario, we might have woken up without our belongings, robbed but alive. Yet something made me believe their intentions went beyond a simple theft. After all, college students don't carry much of value while skiing. Even considering David and Ronald's expensive skis, it seemed excessive. And how could they be sure we had anything worth taking? None of it made sense. Finding the car was a struggle, and reporting the incident to the police was even worse. Driving home completed the chaos of the day. The ski resort staff promised to try identifying the suspects, but since we had to hit the road, we couldn't follow up. The police treated the case more seriously, assuring us they'd reach out if they found anything. I heard the story made it to a local news report, but years have passed, and no answers have surfaced. To this day, we don't know what substance was in that drink. Nothing I've researched explains something that acted so quickly in such a small amount. Perhaps it was a combination of drugs. Luckily, my friends only felt disoriented afterward, but those moments were deeply terrifying. I prefer to believe it was just an elaborate robbery scheme, and nothing worse. My name is Antonio, and I write to you from the heart of my city. There's an old rumor about construction sites that speaks of human sacrifices being made during large projects. Today, I want to share with you a story I heard from my grandfather a long time ago, one that deserves to be known. During the time when a large sports arena was being built, my grandfather was one of the site supervisors. The project was massive, with entire teams of laborers, blacksmiths, bricklayers, plumbers, and engineers working tirelessly. Being a very sociable person, he quickly formed bonds with 8 co-workers, including helpers and supervisors. Early on, he noticed a man arriving in a blue Beetle. The man wore an impeccable, clearly expensive suit and went around asking workers personal questions: who they lived with, where they were from. When it was my grandfather's turn, he refused to answer, feeling it made no sense. Because of this, the man in the suit kicked him off the site. Fortunately, Mr. Fernando, one of the supervisors, intervened on his behalf. The man asked if my grandfather could at least read and write. My grandfather lied and said he could. Sarcastically, the man allowed him to stay, claiming he might be useful somehow. Before leaving, the man yelled to one of the foremen, saying, "We need 200 more," and instructed them to hand out some lists. As the weeks went by, 2 of my grandfather's friends disappeared. Whenever he asked about them, he was always given the same response: not everyone can handle this kind of work. But he had his doubts. He knew most of the workers needed the money, and those 2 were dedicated and experienced, not the type to quit so easily. One scorching day, the work was especially grueling. My grandfather and 4 other co-workers were being overburdened with exhausting tasks. Despite the extreme fatigue, he pushed himself, thinking about the paycheck he'd receive on Saturday. That day, Henrique, one of the workers, collapsed. From a distance, my grandfather saw an engineer and some other men drag Henrique away. He noticed them putting him into a concrete mold, as if it were just part of the job, and then they left without saying a word. The atmosphere of indifference was chilling. Later, my grandfather was ordered to finish the foundation work alone, but he refused, as he had plans with my grandmother that Saturday. In the early hours of the morning, 2 drunk and terrified bricklayers showed up at his house. They warned him never to return to that site, saying helpers, blacksmiths, and even homeless people were disappearing. My grandfather dismissed it, thinking it was just the ramblings of drunk men. Still, their words and what he had witnessed stayed on his mind. He continued working, but began noticing that co-workers without families or who lived far away would vanish under strange circumstances. What affected him the most was the disappearance of a young helper, only 20 years old, full of dreams and dedication. An orphan from a young age, the young man hoped to build a better life for himself. One Saturday, he was offered extra pay to stay late. He accepted. My grandfather expected to see him on Monday, but he never showed up. The foreman and engineers claimed the young man had quit on Saturday, saying he couldn't handle the hard labor. But my grandfather never believed it. He knew the young man was determined and not the type to abandon his goals. On another occasion, he mentioned a batch of concrete brought for the foundation. He described its consistency as strange, almost unnatural. Everyone noticed it but avoided commenting. My grandfather said it felt as if poorly crushed bones were mixed in, and sometimes teeth could be found in the concrete. The numerous disappearances happening across the country, especially in construction sites, reinforced the belief that these dark rumors had some truth to them. Although he never officially shared these stories, my grandfather knew the collective silence hid a shared knowledge. He was convinced many lives were lost there, including those of close friends. Years after the arena was completed, my grandfather became a passionate soccer fan. He visited the stadium several times to watch the local team play. On one of those occasions during a match, he thought he saw the young helper who had disappeared years before. Shocked, he tried to follow him through the crowd. The young man was wearing the exact same work clothes from years ago, and something even more unsettling stood out. He hadn't aged a single day. A shiver ran down his spine as my grandfather decided to follow him to the bathrooms. But when he got there, the place was full of people, none of whom matched the young man he swore he had just seen. Today, my grandfather is no longer with us, but these stories remain alive in my memory. This is one of many he used to tell. Thank you for listening. This might sound a bit strange, but hear me out. Every winter, my friends Stephen and Evan and I keep up a curious tradition. We walk across a frozen lake located several towns away. It's nothing grand, just something we do for fun. There's something magical about being surrounded by a sea of ice and absolute silence. It's one of those small adventures that captivate us. Call it peculiar, but we never tire of that kind of tranquility. If you've ever been alone in nature during a snowstorm, listening only to the soft sound of snowflakes hitting the ground, you'll know what I mean. It feels like having a private piece of the world just for yourself. And well, it always leads to some stunning photos, perfect for anyone wanting to seem cool. This particular episode happened this past winter in April, about 4 months ago. If you're thinking one of us fell through the ice, don't worry, that's not what this is about. That night, it was snowing heavily, which was exactly why we went there. Besides, the temperatures had been freezing for weeks, so we were sure the lake was solid. I must admit, I enjoy winter much more than summer, and I think my friends share that preference for countless reasons. One simple reason is that the snow lights up everything. Even when the sun sets, the world doesn't plunge into total darkness. The light reflecting off the white landscape creates a surreal atmosphere, unique to the season. And that night, the full moon made everything even more incredible. Stephen drove that night since he has a truck that handles snow well. Usually, Evan takes on that job, but this time we left it to Stephen to ensure safety. The lake is surrounded by what you might call a forest, though it's more like a cluster of thin trees than a real forest. This makes it impossible to drive directly to the lake's edge, so we parked in a nearby lot and walked the rest of the way. The cold was biting. We put on our heaviest coats and headed toward the lake. I've never smoked, but Evan and Stephen took the opportunity to light up some cigarettes as we walked. It must have been past midnight, but I'm not sure. I just remember there was no one else around, no animals, no people. Nothing moved except the three of us. We reached the edge of the lake, and as we expected, it seemed completely frozen. While we laughed about something silly, Stephen picked up a rock and threw it at the ice to test its strength. Not a crack appeared, so we ventured a bit further. Of course, we didn't go to the middle of the lake, we're not that reckless, but we walked far enough to be about 30 meters from the shore. That's when we noticed something on the other side, near the trees surrounding the lake. A large, dark figure was moving slowly. We stopped talking immediately. We stood still, just watching. It was massive, hunched over, and walking slowly toward the lake. It occurred to us that it might be a bear. Evan whispered, "Is that a bear?" I didn't reply. My heart was already racing. If it was a bear, any sound might draw its attention, and that was the last thing we wanted. We stayed completely still, barely breathing. But as the figure got closer, something seemed off. The way it moved wasn't like a bear, its posture was upright, almost human, and on top of that it was dragging something. Nothing about it made sense. It was one of the strangest sights I've ever witnessed. Suddenly the figure stood up completely, and we realized all at once that it was a person wearing a bear costume. Stephen murmured, "What the hell is that?" I was thinking the same. Maybe it doesn't sound so scary when I say it like this, but being there, it was terrifying. I tried to say something, but no words came out. I couldn't tell if I was more scared or confused, but something inside me screamed not to make a sound. The figure kept moving, dragging something behind it. At first it was hard to make out because of the snow, but as it got closer we saw it was a small black bag tied to a rope. It looked like a trash bag. The whole scene was disturbing and we couldn't react. My instincts were yelling at me to leave, but my body felt frozen. Evan and Stephen were also paralyzed. Then the man took off the bear costume. Seeing him without the bear suit didn't make the situation any less unsettling. He wasn't large or physically intimidating, but there was something profoundly disturbing about the whole act. We watched as he crouched down as if picking up a rock, though it wasn't clear, and started hitting the ice repeatedly like he was trying to break it. Each strike seemed to send vibrations through the air, even from a distance. It was obvious he wanted to make a hole in the ice to get rid of that bag. Evan lightly tapped my shoulder, and when I looked, he and Stephen were already moving back toward the shore. I followed them without hesitation. We didn't say a word. Every step we took seemed deafening in the stillness of the snow. I doubted he could hear us from that distance, but my heart was pounding. We were just a few meters from the shore when we heard a voice yell, "Hey!" I didn't look back, I just started running, hoping he didn't have a weapon. The cold was suffocating, and after a minute of running I was out of breath. I don't know if he chased us. It didn't seem like it, but at that moment we were overcome with panic. When we reached the edge of the lake, we paused briefly to catch our breath, then continued running to the car. We climbed in without saying much, and Stephen drove away as fast as he could. On the way back, we kept trying to make sense of what had just happened. Stephen suggested it was someone dumping trash in the lake, but the idea seemed absurd. Who would dress up as a bear in the freezing night to do that? Evan thought it might have been someone disposing of a body, but I argued the bag was too small for that. We spent the entire ride debating without reaching any conclusions. To this day, we have no answers. But the reason I'm thinking about it now is that a few days ago, my mum was watching TV, and a news story came up about an old case of a missing child in the area. The timeline of the case matches what we saw that night. I don't want to jump to conclusions. It might just be a coincidence, but it's hard not to see a connection. By the time you hear this story, we'll probably have already reported what we saw to the police. Before we get to the last story, if you're still here, let me know what time you're watching in the comments. I love seeing who sticks around until the end. Let's not stop now. On to the next. Six years ago, I moved to a new city to be closer to the university. I also got a job as a helper at a construction site, something I was already familiar with because I grew up surrounded by construction work. My grandfather, uncles, and father used to take me to work with them, so I already had some experience. In my first days on the job, I worked with the site foreman, a calm and very kind man. One morning, I arrived at the site carrying a coffee I had bought on the way. I was always the first to arrive. I leaned against a low wall, placed the cup on it, and started fiddling with my phone, passing the time on Facebook. When I went to grab the coffee to take a sip, I noticed it was gone. I found it strange. There was no one around, and I had only left the cup there for a few seconds. I decided to look around the construction site. When I entered one of the rooms, still under construction, I began to hear whispers. That intrigued me. I knew no one else had arrived, and the place was still empty without any residents. I continued my search in silence, thinking that in the end, I had just put the coffee somewhere else and forgotten. But as I was leaving the room, I heard the whispers again. This time, they seemed to come from the backyard. I went there, and as I arrived, the voices changed. They now sounded like children laughing. I looked around but saw no one. My body began to shiver. Suddenly, I saw 4 children emerging from behind a pile of cement bags. They ran toward a red door and went inside. A feeling of relief washed over me. At least they were just kids. I figured they were the boss's children or someone else's kids. As they played in the room, I could hear their laughter echoing. I returned to the wall and got distracted by my phone again. It didn't take long for the foreman to arrive. He greeted me. "Good morning," I replied, still uneasy. "Not so much. There are some kids playing around here. They might end up getting in the way." He looked at me puzzled and asked, "What kids?" I explained that I had seen some children going through the red door and suggested they might be the boss's kids. The foreman frowned. He said the boss lived far away and hadn't mentioned anything about bringing children. We went to check the door. When we opened it, the room was completely empty. Right in the center of the room was my coffee cup. The foreman shook his head, skeptical. He thought I was making the whole thing up, so I joked, saying it was just a prank. But the truth is, I never managed to understand what happened. Those kids seemed so real, and at the same time, they didn't seem to belong to this world. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to stay updated on all future narrations. I post new videos here every day. I hope to see you in the next one. On the screen now, I'm leaving 2 other great videos I know you'll enjoy. See you there.